Silent hatred does not disappear, it goes underground and mutates into psychological warfare. What cannot be spoken learns how to hide. What cannot be confronted learns how to operate in secret. And what operates in secret becomes far more dangerous than anything that stands in the open. Loud enemies reveal themselves. Silent ones study you. They memorize your weaknesses. They observe your rhythms. They wait for the moment when your certainty softens and your guard drops just enough for doubt to slip in unnoticed. This is how invisible battles begin. No explosions, no arguments, no dramatic confrontations. Only subtle shifts in energy, a change in tone, a hesitation where support once lived, a smile that no longer reaches the eyes, and the mind feels it long before logic can explain it. You sense resistance without seeing an enemy. You feel tension without being able to name a cause. This is the early stage of psychological warfare, where nothing seems wrong, yet nothing feels right. Silent hatred feeds on repression. When people refuse to face their own bitterness, envy, shame, and failure, they do not eliminate these forces, they relocate them. What they cannot tolerate in themselves becomes something they hunt in others. Their inner chaos demands an external target. Their unresolved wounds require a living mirror. And when someone reflects what they cannot bear to acknowledge, silent hatred attaches itself like a parasite seeking expression. At first it wears the mask of indifference. They pull away without explanation. They withhold warmth without reason. They offer polite distance instead of honest conflict. But silence is not peace. Silence is storage. And stored emotion always ferments under pressure. What goes underground gains intensity. What is buried gains momentum. What is denied becomes sharper, colder, more calculating. This is the stage where hatred stops being emotional and becomes strategic. It is no longer about impulse. It becomes about positioning, influence, control, information. The goal is no longer to express anger, but to disorient the target, to confuse perception, to destabilize confidence, to create uncertainty without ever appearing responsible for it. And this is why psychological warfare is so difficult to defend against, because the attacks arrive disguised as coincidence, misunderstanding, or concern. Subtle comments plant seeds of doubt. Delayed responses create anxiety. Selective silence generates self-questioning. You start replaying conversations in your mind. You begin wondering if you imagine the shift. You feel the pressure, but cannot point to the source. And because the threat is unclear, the nervous system remains on constant alert. This sustained low-level tension erodes clarity, drains emotional energy, and slowly weakens self-trust. This is not accidental. Silent hatred thrives on ambiguity. It requires the victim to remain uncertain, because certainty is immunity. The moment the mind becomes clear, the manipulation loses traction. So confusion is engineered intentionally. Mixed signals are distributed strategically. Praise is followed by withdrawal. Support is paired with subtle undermining. And the psyche, desperate for consistency, begins to fracture under the contradiction. The most dangerous part is that the person waging this hidden war often does not experience themselves as hostile. They feel justified. They feel injured. They feel morally right. Unconscious hatred always believes it is protecting something noble. But what it is truly protecting is the ego's refusal to confront its own shadow. Instead of facing personal inadequacy, resentment is exported. Instead of integrating weakness, blame is externalized. Instead of assuming responsibility, the mind builds an enemy. And once the enemy exists, everything becomes permissible. Now silence becomes a weapon. Distance becomes punishment. Withholding becomes power. Information becomes leverage. The battlefield is no longer physical, it is perceptual. Memory is altered through suggestion. Meaning is distorted through implication. Intent is rewritten through rumor. You are not attacked directly. You are slowly disconnected from your own narrative. Over time, the greatest damage is not the hostility itself, but the internal shift it produces. The target begins to scan their own behavior more than the environment. They begin to self-edit, self-censor, self-doubt. They expend enormous energy trying to restore harmony that was never broken by accident. And this exhaustion makes them easier to influence, easier to confuse, easier to control. Silent hatred seeks domination without exposure. It wants impact without accountability. It wants to weaken without being seen as the cause. And when it succeeds, the victim often feels guilty for feeling attacked at all, because there is no visible proof, no open aggression, no tangible threat, only an atmosphere that slowly poisons perception and drains inner stability. This is how psychological warfare outlives emotional conflict. Emotions burn out, strategies evolve, time becomes a weapon, patience becomes a tool. And the longer the silence continues, the more the original source of hatred is forgotten, replaced by routines of quiet opposition that feel normal, justified, even invisible. In such wars, the most dangerous injuries are not inflicted on the body or reputation, but on identity. When a person begins to question their own intuition, their own memory, their own sense of intention, the war has entered its deepest phase. Because control over perception is control over reality. And once reality can be shaped from the outside, resistance becomes uncertain, delayed, fragmented. This is why silent hatred is far more destructive than open hostility. Open hostility strengthens boundaries. Silent hostility dissolves them. Open enemies sharpen awareness. Silent enemies dissolve vigilance. And long before the victim realizes they are under attack, inner defenses may already be compromised, their confidence already softened, their clarity already clouded, their sense of self already under quiet pressure from forces that never announce themselves, never confront openly, never reveal their hand, yet continue advancing. Through absence, implication, withdrawal, and carefully maintained psychological distance that tightens slowly like an unseen constraint around the mind and emotional stability of the one caught inside it, questioning what changed when it changed, and whether it was ever real at all. The mind projects what it refuses to face in itself onto others, not as a conscious choice, but as a survival reflex of the psyche. What feels unbearable to accept internally must be relocated externally in order for the self-image to remain intact. The ego protects itself by displacement. Instead of saying, "This exists in me," it says, "This exists in you," and in that moment, a private conflict becomes a public accusation, and an inner fracture becomes an outer enemy. Projection is not born from awareness, it is born from fear. The person who cannot tolerate their own weakness will be hypersensitive to weakness in others. The one who denies their aggression will see hostility everywhere. The one who suppresses desire will moralize against temptation. What is disowned internally becomes exaggerated externally. And because the original trait is unconscious, the emotional reaction toward others is always disproportional, charged with intensity that does not match the visible situation. This is why certain people provoke irrational rage, instant judgment, or uncontrollable contempt without obvious cause. They are not being reacted to as individuals, but as symbols. They represent something the observer has buried alive inside themselves. And buried things do not die quietly. They push outward. They leak. They distort perception until the external world appears to be the source of what was always internal tension. Projection allows a person to feel innocent while acting destructive. It removes responsibility from the self and places it onto a target. The mind feels relieved because guilt has been exported. Shame has been transferred. Conflict has been relocated. The internal pressure drops temporarily, but the cost is the creation of psychological enemies in the outer world. And once an enemy is created, the mind reorganizes itself around opposition rather than integration. The projected trait becomes hunted. If someone denies their own envy, they will accuse others of being jealous. If someone represses their manipulativeness, they will perceive manipulation in every interaction. If someone fears their own emptiness, they will attack others for being superficial. The projection reshapes reality into a battlefield where the self is always the victim and the other is always the threat. And the more intense the repression, the more violent the projection. Mild denial creates irritation. Deep denial creates obsession. What cannot be consciously accepted becomes unconsciously persecuted. The mind becomes both accuser and executioner without ever realizing what it is truly attacking. And in this process, the individual grows further separated from themselves while becoming increasingly entangled with imagined enemies outside. Projection also infects relationships. Instead of meeting another person as they are, the projected image is imposed upon them. A partner becomes the shadow container. A colleague becomes the mirror for disowned ambition. A stranger becomes the embodiment of rejected fear. And slowly, the relationship collapses under the weight of a role the other person never chose but is forced to carry. What makes projection especially dangerous is that it feels true. It does not announce itself as distortion. It presents itself as perception. The emotional certainty is so strong that questioning it feels like betrayal of instinct. And because the projected content is unconscious. The person cannot recognize it as their own. To them, it is obvious. It is confirmed by emotion. It is reinforced by interpretation. Reality bends to fit the inner narrative. This mechanism becomes the invisible engine of conflict, hatred, rivalry, and psychological violence. Wars between people often begin as wars within individuals. Entire groups project their denied aggression onto other groups and call it defense. Entire communities disown their fear and label it threat in others. What is refused inside multiplies outside. What is denied individually becomes destructive collectively. Projection also protects stagnation. As long as everything wrong is always out there, nothing inside must change. Growth becomes unnecessary. Self-examination becomes dangerous. Accountability becomes an enemy. And so the cycle repeats endlessly. The more the mind avoids itself, the more it creates targets. The more it attacks the target, the safer it feels from its own reflection. But the safety is an illusion. The disowned parts do not vanish. They accumulate in the unconscious. They grow in pressure. They seek stronger outlets. Over time, projection intensifies. The person becomes more rigid in judgment, more reactive in emotion, more addicted to opposition. Their identity slowly shapes itself around what they oppose rather than what they understand. And the inner world becomes increasingly alienated from the outer narrative they are forced to maintain. The deepest danger of projection is not what it does to others, but what it does to the self. Every projected trait is a piece of the psyche exiled from awareness. Every accusation is a confession made unconsciously. Every enemy outside marks a territory within that remains unintegrated. And the longer this continues, the more fragmented the personality becomes. Wholeness is sacrificed for the comfort of blame. The moment projection is withdrawn, the entire psychological structure trembles. The mind must face what it has avoided. The self must confront traits it has despised. The emotional charge that once fueled conflict now turns inward as responsibility. This is why most people resist the projection. It threatens the identity they have built around opposition. It demands courage without enemies. It demands strength without justification. To face what one has projected is to reclaim lost pieces of the self. To own what one has condemned is to dissolve the false boundary between purity and corruption. To integrate what was denied is to end the need for external enemies. But this integration feels like collapse before it feels like freedom, because the ego must relinquish its familiar armor of blame and its addictive sense of moral superiority in exchange for uncertainty, vulnerability, the destabilizing awareness that what was hated outside had always lived inside the same psychic structure that imagined itself innocent, attacked, and separate from the very forces it could never truly escape or destroy. Because they were woven into its own emotional substance, memory, instinct, fear, desire, and unexamined depths, where the true origin of judgment had always been waiting, without accusation, without defense, without any order between self and other to divide what had been split for so long. The most dangerous enemies are not loud. They smile while sharpening their weapons, because noise reveals intention, but silence conceals strategy. Loud hostility gives you a direction to defend against. Quiet hostility gives you nothing to hold on to. It hides behind politeness, camouflage, and social masks that appear harmless while calculating pressure points beneath the surface. The smiling face becomes the perfect disguise for concealed opposition, because trust is the greatest access point an adversary can ever obtain. The silent adversary studies rather than attacks. They watch patterns. They memorize your reactions. They take note of what excites you and what unsettles you. They wait for your rhythm to become predictable. And while everything on the surface remains friendly, something beneath remains cold, patient, and alert. This is why their presence feels subtly draining rather than confrontational. You feel observed rather than threatened. And observation without exposure is the first stage of psychological precision. The danger lies not in their aggression, but in their composure. They do not strike from impulse. They act from timing. They do not react, they prepare. Their restraint is not maturity, it is containment. Their calm is not peace, it is calculation. The smile creates a false sense of safety that lowers your defenses. And lowered defenses invite infiltration rather than resistance. Such enemies rarely announce conflict. They avoid open disagreement. They avoid visible confrontation. Instead, they create influence quietly. They place seeds of doubt through suggestion. They redirect narratives through implication. They position themselves between you and others as translators of your intentions. And in this space between perception and reality, control becomes possible without ever appearing forceful. The smiling enemy thrives on ambiguity. Their actions can always be explained away. Their words always carry multiple interpretations. If confronted, they retreat into innocence. If accused, they dissolve into reasonableness. This flexibility protects them from accountability. And accountability is what most threatens a strategic adversary. They need to remain unseen as an aggressor in order to maintain both access and advantage. What makes them most effective is proximity. They operate within circles of trust, shared spaces, familiar structures. Strangers have no leverage. Allies have access. The smiling enemy becomes dangerous precisely because they are allowed close. They hear what is not shared publicly. They witness vulnerability. They observe hesitation. And every piece of access becomes a tool that can be used later without leaving fingerprints. Their weapon is not force but leverage, not attack but timing, not confrontation but positioning. They do not destroy directly. They weaken context. They alter how others perceive you. They recast your intentions. They highlight your failures while softly erasing your strengths. They influence atmospheres rather than outcomes. And by the time outcomes shift, the original influence is invisible. This kind of adversary often feels impossible to prove. There is no single act to point to, no obvious betrayal. Only a gradual erosion of standing, connection, and clarity. You sense opposition, but the evidence remains circumstantial. And the lack of visible proof protects them while isolating you in your own perception. The smiling enemy also understands emotional economy. They conserve energy. They spend it only when the return is high. They wait for moments when you are distracted, tired, exposed, or celebrating. They choose times when you are least prepared to defend, and because their actions arrive out of rhythm with your attention, they pass beneath your conscious radar. Their restraint is not mercy. It is efficiency. They are not slow because they are indecisive. They are slow because they are precise. Every move must serve several purposes at once: advancing position, weakening rivals, strengthening alliances, maintaining appearances. And the appearance must always remain benevolent. This duality is what makes them so dangerous. The outer face builds trust. The inner motive builds advantage. And because human beings are wired to trust visual and emotional cues, the smile overrides suspicion long before reason can intervene. The body relaxes. The mind lowers guard. Access is granted. The greatest mistake is to believe that danger always announces itself through aggression. True predators do not rely on intimidation. They rely on misdirection. They do not provoke panic. They cultivate comfort. And comfort is the fastest way into proximity, vulnerability, and influence. The smiling enemy rarely wants to eliminate you completely. Elimination creates question. Disappearance attracts investigation. They prefer slow diminishment. They prefer to reduce presence, credibility, authority, connection. They prefer outcomes that look like coincidence, miscommunication, personal decline. And when destruction looks natural, no one searches for an architect. Over time, the true damage is not just what they take from you externally, but what they remove internally. Confidence erodes. Instinct dulls. Trust fractures. The target begins to second-guess perceptions. The mind hesitates before responding. And hesitation is the opening through which control enters quietly. The most dangerous weapon they possess is not deception, but patience. Because patience outlasts vigilance. No one can remain perpetually alert without exhaustion. And exhaustion is when infiltration becomes effortless. Walls soften, boundaries blur. Discernment fatigues. By the time the smiling enemy is recognized for what they are, they have often already achieved what they intended. Access has been converted into leverage. Leverage into influence, influence into outcomes. And the original disguise remains intact because the consequences appear disconnected from any visible aggression. This is why the most dangerous enemies are not loud. They do not threaten. They do not warn. They do not reveal their hand. They simply remain present, agreeable, accommodating, and observant, collecting patterns, storing moments, tracking vulnerabilities, and shaping events with such subtlety that resistance feels misplaced, suspicion feels unkind, and defense feels unnecessary until the pressure has already shifted the balance beyond easy recovery and the smile remains unchanged, while everything around it quietly rearranges itself in a direction you never consciously agreed to, but somehow now must. Live inside, while still searching for the moment you should have questioned what felt harmless, friendly, supportive, and safe as it moves, steadily from access into advantage, into quiet control over spaces you once believed were your own. Every unexamined shadow eventually seeks a target, because what is denied within cannot remain dormant forever. What the mind refuses to see does not disappear, it waits. It gathers pressure in the unconscious. It grows in intensity beneath layers of distraction, justification, and avoidance. The shadow is not evil by nature. It is simply everything the conscious identity has rejected in order to survive, belong, or feel superior. But rejection does not neutralize power. It only displaces it into darkness, where it becomes autonomous. The shadow forms from fear, shame, anger, envy, helplessness, desire, and unmet needs that were once too threatening to accept. Instead of being integrated, these forces are locked away. The individual learns to appear controlled, moral, strong, or pure. But the shadow retains everything that was sacrificed for that image. And what is suppressed without understanding gains momentum without guidance. At first, the shadow whispers through subtle urges, irritations, and impulses that seem to come from nowhere. The person snaps in moments that do not match the situation. They feel envy toward people they barely know. They harbor resentment they cannot explain. These are not random flaws. They are signals of stored energy seeking expression. The shadow does not demand perfection. It demands recognition. When recognition is withheld, the shadow looks outward. It searches the world for mirrors that resemble its own buried content. A person who denies their aggression will perceive aggression in others. A person who disowns their hunger for power will accuse others of control. A person who buries their vulnerability will despise weakness wherever it appears. The shadow chooses targets that resemble what was exiled from the self. This targeting is not intellectual. It is instinctive. The emotional reaction arrives before thought. Dislike precedes reason. Contempt appears without a clear cause. The shadow does not explain itself, it reacts. And because the conscious mind does not know the true origin of the reaction, it invents justifications to make the hostility feel righteous, logical, deserved. This is how inner darkness becomes outer conflict. The shadow does not attack the self directly because the self has already rejected it. Instead, it hunts externally for symbolic stand-ins. The world becomes populated with enemies that carry the face of one's own denied nature. And each attack feels like defense because the psyche believes it is protecting its identity from threat. The more unexamined the shadow, the more rigid the personality becomes. Moral certainty replaces curiosity. Judgment replaces reflection. Opposition replaces integration. The person becomes defined not by who they are, but by what they oppose. And the louder their virtue signals, the deeper their shadow pressure often runs beneath the surface. Every shadow needs a vessel. If the self refuses to contain it, another person will be forced to carry it. Friends become rivals. Partners become enemies. Strangers become symbols of everything despised within. The shadow moves through gossip, accusation, sabotage, passive aggression, and emotional withdrawal. It rarely arrives as honesty. It arrives as distortion. The tragedy is that the target is often innocent of the true crime. They are not attacked for what they have done, but for what they represent. They embody a trait the attacker is unable to own. Their confidence exposes insecurity. Their freedom exposes repression. Their success exposes stagnation. The shadow reacts not because of harm, but because of reflection. And once the shadow finds a target, it feeds on repetition. Each hostile thought strengthens the inner narrative. Each act of blame reinforces the illusion that the darkness lives only outside. Each confrontation deepens the split between self-image and hidden reality. The shadow grows bolder as the conscious self grows more defended. Over time, this dynamic escalates. What began as irritation becomes fixation. What began as envy becomes sabotage. What began as judgment becomes persecution. The shadow does not seek fairness, it seeks release. And when release is blocked internally, it becomes destructive externally. The most dangerous shadows are carried by those who believe they do not have one. Denial creates innocence without awareness. The person feels justified in every attack because they cannot see what is driving it. Their actions feel moral, necessary, even noble. And this belief makes the damage they cause feel invisible to them. The shadow will always find a way out. If it cannot express through creativity, it will express through conflict. If it cannot speak through insight, it will speak through projection. If it cannot move through consciousness, it will erupt through behavior. Energy does not vanish. It only changes form. The longer the shadow remains unexamined, the less choice the individual has in how it manifests. What could have emerged as self-knowledge turns into compulsion. What could have become strength turns into destruction. What could have been owned becomes something that owns the person from behind the scenes. To examine the shadow is to interrupt this cycle. It is to turn the eyes inward instead of outward. It is to ask not who is the enemy, but what within me is demanding expression. It is to become responsible for one's darkness instead of outsourcing it to the world. But this act feels like death to the ego. It dismantles the heroic self-image. It collapses the story of pure victimhood. It removes the comfort of blame. And that is why most people resist it. Because blaming others feels easier than confronting the parts of the self that were buried to survive. Yet the cost of resistance is always paid by someone else. When the shadow is not faced within, it must be acted out upon another. When it is not integrated, it must be inflicted. When it is not understood, it must be externalized. And so the unexamined shadow continues moving through families, friendships, institutions, and societies, searching for a body to strike, a voice to use, a conflict to inhabit, a target to absorb the darkness that was never claimed by the one who carries it inside themselves. The real battlefield is not the world outside, but the unconscious within. Because every visible conflict is only the surface reflection of an invisible inner war. What appears as struggle against circumstances, people, or fate is often the outer expression of forces that were never brought into awareness. The mind fights itself first, long before it ever fights the world. Desires clash with fears. Instinct battles image. Truth collides with comfort. And the individual experiences the consequences without always recognizing the source. The unconscious is not passive. It is active, dynamic, and relentlessly influential. It shapes choices, reactions, attachments, aversions, and patterns long before the conscious mind claims authorship. The person believes they are deciding freely, yet much of what moves them originates beneath awareness, driven by needs they have never named, and wounds they have never examined. This is why people repeat what they swear to avoid, choose what they insist they hate, and sabotage what they consciously desire. Every unresolved memory becomes a silent commander. Every suppressed emotion becomes a covert operator. Every denied urge becomes a hidden motive. The inner world organizes behavior with astonishing precision, while the conscious mind creates stories to explain the outcomes after they occur. The battlefield is active even when no external conflict exists. Tension builds not from circumstances, but from contradiction within the self. The unconscious fights for expression. What is buried does not dissolve. It seeks channels. It pushes through dreams, symptoms, attraction, repulsion, impulse, and sudden emotion. And when it is blocked repeatedly, it does not retreat, it transforms. It becomes anxiety without cause. It becomes anger without direction. It becomes sadness without language. The individual feels disturbed without knowing why, restless without knowing what is being resisted. Much of what people call fate is the unconscious insisting on visibility. Much of what they call bad luck is unresolved material returning through circumstance. The world appears hostile only because the inner world is divided. When the psyche is split against itself, reality feels like opposition. Resistance multiplies externally because it is unresolved internally. The unconscious also chooses enemies. It projects inner conflict onto outer figures. What the person cannot face within appears embodied in someone else. The rejected trait becomes the hated characteristic. The denied desire becomes the condemned behavior. The announced fear becomes the perceived threat. The outer battle intensifies only because the inner battle remains hidden. This is why people can win external wars and still feel defeated. Success does not neutralize inner fracture. Achievement does not resolve inner contradiction. Dominance does not restore inner unity. The battlefield within remains active regardless of what happens outside. Victories feel hollow. Defeats feel catastrophic. Both are amplified by unresolved inner tension. The unconscious also wages war through repetition. It recreates emotional environments until the individual becomes conscious of the pattern. The same relationship dynamics reappear with different faces. The same conflicts arise in new settings. The same pain returns through altered circumstances. The individual feels trapped by destiny, yet it is the unconscious reenacting unfinished business in search of resolution. Avoidance strengthens the enemy within. Every time a truth is pushed away, it gains autonomy. Every time emotion is numbed, it gains pressure. Every time instinct is shamed, it gains distortion. The unconscious grows more powerful the less it is acknowledged. What is brought to light becomes choice. What remains in darkness becomes compulsion. Fear dominates because it lives closest to the unconscious surface. It attaches itself to imagined threats outside because the true threat inside remains unrecognized. The individual becomes hypervigilant toward the world while blind toward the self. They defend against visible dangers while being directed by invisible ones. The real battlefield also explains why people react more intensely than situations require. A minor insult feels like annihilation. A small rejection feels like abandonment. A simple disagreement feels like betrayal. The emotional charge does not belong to the moment, it belongs to memory. The past fights through the present when it has never been processed consciously. When the unconscious is ignored, it does not grow silent. It grows symbolic. Dreams speak what the waking mind refuses. The body expresses what language suppresses. The psyche creates crisis to interrupt stagnation. And still, the individual often seeks external causes without realizing the crisis was generated from within. The most exhausting wars are fought not against enemies, but against one's own inner contradiction. Wanting and fearing the same outcome, longing and resisting the same intimacy, seeking change and clinging to familiarity. The unconscious pulls in one direction while the conscious pulls in another. The individual stands in the center feeling torn without understanding why. Integration is the only truce. To become aware of what operates beneath awareness is to disarm the battlefield, not by destroying the unconscious, but by understanding it, not by suppressing darkness, but by recognizing its message. The real enemy was never the impulse, it was the refusal to listen to what the impulse was trying to reveal. When the unconscious is made conscious, it no longer needs to fight for survival through sabotage. When emotion is allowed awareness, it no longer needs to erupt through chaos. When instinct is acknowledged, it no longer needs to dominate from the shadows. Power returns to choice instead of compulsion. But this awakening destabilizes identity. The stories built on innocence, blame, and justification begin to crack. The individual must accept complicity in patterns they once blamed entirely on fate, others, or circumstance. This is the cost of exiting the battlefield within. The price is the collapse of comforting illusions. Many prefer to remain at war because war preserves the narrative of the wrong self. War creates meaning through opposition. War provides enemies to blame. Peace within removes all external excuses. It places responsibility where it was avoided for years. And so the real battlefield continues inside most people, not because it cannot be ended, but because ending it requires the courage to look without defense, to feel without justification, to remember without distortion, and to accept without projection the forces that were always shaping perception, reaction, memory, identity, and behavior from the hidden layer of the psyche, where conflict was never about the world at all, but about divided awareness struggling to become whole.